Chapter 1 of The Wrong Box. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Wrong Box by Robert Louis Stevenson and Lloyd Osborne. Chapter 1 in which Morris suspects. How very little does the amateur, dwelling at home at ease, comprehend the labours and perils of the author, and when he smilingly skims the surface of a work of fiction, how little does he consider the hours of toil, consultation of authorities, researches in the Bodleian, correspondence with learned and illegible Germans, in one word, the vast scaffolding that was first built up and then knocked down, to while away an hour for him in a railway train. Thus I might begin this tale with a biography of Tonti, birthplace, parentage, genius, probably inherited from his mother, remarkable instance of precocity, etc., and a complete treatise on the system to which he bequeathed his name. The material is all beside me in a pigeon-hole, but I scorn to appear vainglorious. Tonti is dead, and I never saw any one who even pretended to regret him, and as for the tontine system, a word will suffice for all the purposes of this unvarnished narrative. A number of sprightly youths, the more the merrier, put up a certain sum of money, which is then funded in a pool under trustees. Coming on for a century later, the proceeds are fluttered for a moment in the face of the last survivor, who is probably deaf, so that he cannot even hear of his success, and who is certainly dying, so that he might just as well have lost. The peculiar poetry and even humour of the scheme is now apparent, since it is one by which nobody concerned can possibly profit, but its fine sportsmanlike character endeared it to our grandparents. When Joseph Finsbury and his brother Masterman were little lads in white-frilled trousers, their father, a well-to-do merchant in Cheapside, caused them to join a small but rich tontine of 37 lives. £1,000 was the entrance fee, and Joseph Finsbury can remember to this day the visit to the lawyers, where the members of the tontine, all children like himself, were assembled together, and sat in turn in the big office chair, and signed their names, with the assistance of a kind old gentleman in spectacles and Wellington boots. He remembers playing with the children afterwards on the lawn at the back of the lawyer's house, and a battle royal that he had with a brother tontiner who had kicked his shins. The sound of war called forth the lawyer from where he was dispensing cake and wine to the assembled parents in the office, and the combatants were separated, and Joseph's spirit, for he was the smaller of the two, commended by the gentleman in the Wellington boots, who vowed that he had been just such another at the same age. Joseph wondered to himself if he had worn at that time little Wellingtons and a little bald head, and when in bed at night he grew tired of telling himself stories of sea fights, he used to dress himself up as the old gentleman, and entertain other little boys and girls with cake and wine. In the year 1840 the 37 were all alive. In 1850 their numbers had decreased by 6. In 1856 and 1857 business was more lively, for the Crimea and the Mutiny carried off no less than 9. There remained in 1870 but 5 of the original members, and at the date of my story, including the 2 Finsburys, but 3. By this time Masterman was in his 73rd year. He had long complained of the effects of age, having long since retired from business, and now lived in absolute seclusion under the roof of his son Michael, the well-known solicitor. Joseph, on the other hand, was still up and about, and still presented but a semi-venerable figure on the streets in which he loved to wander. This was the more to be deplored because Masterman had led, even to the least particular, a model British life. Industry, regularity, respectability, and a preference for the 4% are understood to be the very foundations of a green old age. All these Masterman had eminently displayed, and here he was, ab agendo, at 73, while Joseph, barely 2 years younger and in the most excellent preservation, had disgraced himself through life by idleness and eccentricity. Embarked in the leather trade, he had early wearied of business, for which he was supposed to have small parts. A taste for general information, not properly checked, had soon begun to sap his manhood. There is no passion more debilitating to the mind, unless perhaps it be that itch of public speaking which it not infrequently accompanies or begets. The two were conjoined in the case of Joseph. The acute stage of this double malady, that in which the patient delivers gratuitous lectures, soon declared itself with severity, and not many years had passed over his head before he would have travelled 30 miles to address an infant school. He was no student. His reading was confined to elementary textbooks and the daily papers. He did not even fly as high as cyclopaedias. Life, he would say, was his volume. His lectures were not meant, he would declare, for college professors. They were addressed direct to the great heart of the people, and the heart of the people must certainly be sounder than its head, for his lucubrations were received with favour. That entitled How to Live Cheerfully on £40 a Year created a sensation among the unemployed. Education, its aims, objects, purposes, and desirability, gained him the respect of the shallow-minded. As for his celebrated essay on Life Insurance regarded in its relation to the masses, read before the Working Men's Mutual Improvement Society, Isle of Dogs, it was received with a literal ovation by an unintelligent audience of both sexes, and so marked was the effect that he was next year elected honorary president of the institution, an office of less than no emolument, since the holder was expected to come down with a donation, but one which highly satisfied his self-esteem. While Joseph was thus building himself up a reputation among the more cultivated portion of the ignorant, his domestic life was suddenly overwhelmed by orphans. The death of his younger brother Jacob saddled him with the charge of 2 boys, Morris and John, and in the course of the same year his family was still further swelled by the addition of a little girl, the daughter of John Henry Hazeltine, Esquire, a gentleman of small property and fewer friends. He had met Joseph only once, at a lecture hall in Holloway, but from that formative experience he returned home to make a new will and consign his daughter and her fortune to the lecturer. Joseph had a kindly disposition, and yet it was not without reluctance that he accepted this new responsibility, advertised for a nurse, and purchased a second-hand perambulator. Morris and John he made more readily welcome, not so much because of the tie of consanguinity, as because the leather business, in which he hastened to invest their fortune of £30,000, had recently exhibited inexplicable symptoms of decline. A young but capable Scot was chosen as manager to the enterprise, and the cares of business never again afflicted Joseph Finsbury. Leaving his charges in the hands of the capable Scot, who was married, he began his extensive travels on the Continent and in Asia Minor. With a polyglot testament in one hand and a phrase book in the other, he groped his way among the speakers of 11 European languages. The first of these guides is hardly applicable to the purposes of the philosophic traveller, and even the second is designed more expressly for the tourist than for the expert in life. But he pressed interpreters into his service, whenever he could get their services for nothing, and by one means and another filled many notebooks with the result of his researches. In these wanderings he spent several years, and only returned to England when the increasing age of his charges needed his attention. The 2 lads had been placed in a good but economical school, where they had received a sound commercial education, which was somewhat awkward, as the leather business was by no means in a state to court inquiry. In fact, when Joseph went over his accounts, preparatory to surrendering his trust, he was dismayed to discover that his brother's fortune had not increased by his stewardship, even by making over to his 2 wards every penny he had in the world, there would still be a deficit of £7,800. When these facts were communicated to the 2 brothers in the presence of a lawyer, Morris Finsbury threatened his uncle with all the terrors of the law, and was only prevented from taking extreme steps by the advice of the professional man. "You cannot get blood from a stone," observed the lawyer. And Morris saw the point, and came to terms with his uncle. On the one side, Joseph gave up all that he possessed, and assigned to his nephew his contingent interest in the tontine, already quite a hopeful